Good evening, everybody. It is a pleasure to be here with you. Is from Pax Americana to Pax Mysteriana. For those of you who know Latin, you will wonder about my ignorance. The Latin word for mystery is mysterium, but I chose from Pax Americana to Pax Mysteriana because it is an alliteration. It rhymes, and it's clear what it means. Now, Sandhya has already outlined for you the object, the structure of my talk. So let me plunge right in. The existing world order at any juncture in time reflects the balance of global economic and political power. It can change over time as an outcome of decisive shifts in the balance. But history reveals that such changes are few. This is because the evolution of a world order is a slow process that may span a century or even longer, so that transitions from one to the next can stretch over decades. For this reason, a long term historical perspective is essential, albeit brief. The Industrial Revolution in the late 18th century was a turning point for the world. It was the beginning of the end of Asia's overwhelming significance in the world economy. And it was the beginning of the rise of Europe, in particular Great Britain, to dominance in the world. Um, for almost 150 years, the sun never set on the British Empire. In this age of colonialism and imperialism, British economic primacy was the implicit world order manifest in state power and naval power, which provided protection for its economic and political interests in distant lands as well as its merchant ships in distant waters. The early 20th century was the next turning point. It was the beginning of the end of Britain's dominance, and it was the beginning of the rise of the United States to dominance in the world. This process spanned half a century. The League of Nations, established after the First World War in 1920, as an intergovernmental organization to promote international cooperation and maintain international peace, was, we know, a miserable failure during the transition from Pax Britannica to Pax Americana, which was complete by 1950. At the end of World War II, which brought destruction and chaos across the globe, the United States sought to construct a new world order that was largely in place by the late 1940s. It was based on international institutions, rules, and practices in a quest for a broadly free international market, essentially underwritten by American economic strength and military power. This world order, which has spanned 75 years so far, is not without its limitations or flaws. Yet, it managed to preserve the peace between superpowers in the Cold War era and broadly in the world as a whole during the 1990s and 2000s, although it has struggled to cope since then. There were, of course, geographically bound conflicts, in many of which big nations lost small wars. It was also conducive to decades of rapid economic growth, unprecedented in human history, beginning with the post war economic reconstruction in Europe, gathering momentum, and in Japan, gathering momentum in the era of markets and globalization during the 1980s, which improved living standards for ordinary people in the industrial north and lifted billions out of poverty in the global south, although it was associated with a rapid, almost exponential increase in economic inequalities between countries as well as people. But this existing world order is now under stress. The first 2 decades of the 21st century have witnessed a discernible change in the balance of global economic power. Financial crises have dented faith in markets. mounting economic inequalities have created social and political discontents among people. International institutions are creaking at the seams. The IMF and the World Bank have failed to reinvent themselves for changed times. The World Trade Organization, the WTO, seems to be at a dead end. The United Nations system, which has lost its way, is neither credible nor effective. Even if the present world, may I say, sorely needs such an institution for its designated critical roles. Globalization is at risk. Economies are going through difficult times, if not crises, with growth slowdowns, double digit inflation, and persistent or high unemployment. Politics within countries is contentious, if not polarized. The geopolitical divides are visible and sharper than they have been for decades. International relations are strained, and there are several flashpoints across the world. Clearly, this is a most difficult economic and political conjuncture for the world. The object of my talk is to analyze the world order that was put in place at the end of World War II, highlight the contours of its evolution and its multiple quiet crises 75 years later, to set the stage for discussing possible future scenarios in 2050. There is no obvious measure of how economic power is distributed between countries in the world. Even if imperfect, perhaps the best index is their share in world GDP, which would also highlight changes in their relative importance over time. Now, I've calculated the share of three major country groups, 7 geographical, almost continental regions, and 12 selected large countries in world GDP at current prices and market exchange rates during the period from 1970 to 2022, a little more than half a century. This statistical evidence, spanning more than half a century, reflects a very clear shift in the balance of economic power. So I'd urge you to be a little patient. I will mention numbers only for the next 5 minutes and not thereafter. It'll be words. Now, the change in the share of the three major country groups, once described as the East, the West, and the South, in world GDP, reveal very clear trends. First, the share of the former USSR and Eastern Europe dropped sharply from 15% in 1970 to 5% in 1990 and 2% in 2000, but stabilized at around 4% thereafter. Second, the share of industrialized countries, broadly speaking the West and Japan, was in the range of 68% until 1980. It rose to a level of 75-80% until 2005, but then dropped very sharply to 60% in 2015, after which it diminished further to 55% in 2022. Third, the share of developing countries remained in the range of 17%, and that's Asia, Africa, Latin America, until 2000, climbed steadily thereafter and rapidly during the period 2025 to 2015 to reach as much as 40% in 2022. Now, statistical evidence on the distribution of world GDP by geographical regions, North America, Europe, West, North, and South, Eastern Europe and the former USSR, industrialized Asia, which is essentially largely Japan, but also includes South Korea and Israel, developing Asia, Latin America, and Africa tells a very similar story. It shows that the share of North America and Europe was about 60% until 2005, but dropped to 50% in 2010 and 47% in 2022. Their share of industrialized Asia, and that's an interesting story, rose from 6.4% in 1970 to a little over 18% in 1995, but fell back once again to 6.4% by 2022. The story of the former USSR and Eastern Europe, I have already mentioned, were dismal. The share of Latin America and the Caribbean was in the range of 5% for much of this period, while the share of Africa dropped from its peak of 5% in 1980 to less than 3% in 2022. The share of developing Asia increased steadily from a mere 8% in 1970 to 14% in 2005, after which it rose rapidly to reach 32% in 2022. And that's the highlight of this story. Now, the last set of numbers, the share of 12 selected large countries, neither in alphabetical order nor in order of GDP, the United States, Germany, France, UK, Japan, Russia, South Korea, China, India, Indonesia, Brazil, and Mexico. They are probably amongst the top 15 countries in the world in terms of GDP. It provides a more disaggregated, even if a less complete picture. It shows, and this is important to recognize, that the share of the United States in world GDP was in the range of 25 to 33%, one-fourth to one-third, for the entire period. The story of Japan is a sharp contrast. Its share rose from 6.2% in 1970 to almost 18% in 1995, but dropped sharply to 4% in 2022. The share of France and UK has fluctuated in the range 4-5% until 2010, and it diminished thereafter, while that of a unified Germany dropped from its peak level of 8% during 1995 to just about 5% in the 2000s, and dropped to 4% by 2022. The share of Brazil and Mexico remained mostly in the range of 1 to 2% throughout. The share of Russia, too, was 1 to 2% through the period 1995 to 2022, after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The share of South Korea visibly improved from 0.3% in 1970 to 1.7% in 2000, stabilizing there, roughly, a smaller country. The share of Indonesia rose from 0.3% in 1970 to 1% in 2010, were no significant change thereafter. The share of India was in the range of 1 to 2% until 2005, but increased slowly to 3.5% by 2022. The stunning rise of China is striking. In 1990, the share of China was about the same as that of India and Brazil, but it increased steadily to 5% in 2005 and rose rapidly thereafter to reach 18% in 2022. In sum, and that's the end of the figures I'll give you, but it is important to get a sense of what they are. In sum, the period from 1970 to 2022 witnessed profound changes in the global balance of economic power, a rapid economic decline of the former USSR and Eastern Europe, the rise and fall of Japan, which stayed roughly where it was, an economic recovery in Western Europe until 2000, followed by a relative decline that gathered momentum in 2010, and it suggests an absolute decline in the United Kingdom. Continued economic dominance of the West until 2000, and the steady rise of Asia, including the stunning rise of China since 2000. The significance of the United States reflected in its share of world GDP in the range of 1/4 to 1/3 was perhaps the only reality that did not change. Now, let me turn to the multiple crises that afflict this world order. The raison d'etre of any world order is simple. National laws would suffice if economic space coincides broadly with geographical space. However, in the contemporary world, we know economic space extends much beyond geographical or political space. Moreover, conflicts or wars between countries arise from the pursuit of national interests as perceived by governments. But countries are not subject to any international laws because there is no world government or parliament that can enact laws that are binding on nations. Obviously, creating rules or laws that are binding on sovereign nation states, which implies ceding national sovereignty in some respects, is difficult since it is subject to mutual acceptance. Yet, a world order a broadly acceptable framework is both necessary and desirable to preserve global public goods such as peace, environment, or human health, and to regulate global public bads such as wars, environment degradation, or pandemics. Now, in recent times, the existing world order has been unable to perform such a role. Examples abound. The Russia-Ukraine war that started in early 2022, I'll just give you three examples, disrupted global supply chains in food and fuels. Russia and Ukraine together are an important source of supply for wheat, maize, edible oils, and fertilizer in the world market, while Russia is a primary source of oil and natural gas. This has led to double-digit inflation that has hurt the poor and vulnerable, particularly in North Africa, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, and in some parts of South Asia. The Israel-Hamas conflict that erupted on both sides of the Gaza Strip could escalate into a larger war and shatter the fragile peace in the Middle East, leading to a further spike in oil prices with dire consequences for the world economy. Now, these wars might be localized, but if they continue, they are bound to have a global impact. Alas, there is no credible or effective institutional mechanism in the world order that could help restore peace. Environmental degradation and climate change stare us in the face. There are more frequent occurrences across the world of forest fires, floods, droughts, excess rainfall, rising sea levels, receding glaciers, temperatures above 50 degrees Celsius in Beijing or in the south of the United States, or wet bulb temperatures in India at which humans cannot survive, and so on. Humankind, it seems to me, is mortgaging its future. In every sphere, please remember that the poor and the marginalized are the most vulnerable. Of course, even the rich are not immune. Yet, effective progress is much too slow. The scrutiny of actions on pledges made in the 2015 Paris Agreement at successive COP meetings since then is simply ineffective. Countries wax eloquent in comfort because none of these are binding obligations, and they are in any case to be met sometime in the distant future. The global coronavirus pandemic turned the world upside down for 2 years, imposing an enormous burden on economies and peoples everywhere. The total number of the deaths in the world associated with COVID-19 is estimated by the WHO at about 7 million. It was simply not recognized that problems without passports need solutions without passports. Instead, at a time when international collective action was an imperative, the response of governments was driven by perceived national interests, erecting national barriers to international travel, despite the knowledge that microbes, germs, and viruses will inevitably cross borders, or accumulating vaccines when so many people in other countries remain unvaccinated. The most effective response would have been international cooperation instead of a myopic pursuit of illusory national interests. Now, at this juncture, it would seem that the willingness and ability of governments to coordinate in terms of implementing the much needed collective action has been exacerbated by a widespread resurgence of nationalisms. In the West, nationalist conservative political parties are in office as governments, or a part of coalition governments, or close contestants for political power in elections to come. Similarly, in a number of countries in the global south, populist authoritarian regimes, political parties, or leaders, often elected through a democratic process, which is precisely what they seek to undermine, articulate their strong belief in nationalism. Inevitably, such political ideologies stress their perception of national interests, sometimes and more so associated with the militarism that is reminiscent to me of the world a century ago in the late 1920s, early 1930s. Inevitably, such political ideologies stress their perception of national interests, sometimes associated with the militarism. In doing so, and this is important, they often erode the autonomy of institutions and the freedoms of citizens. It is no surprise that such governments shun the idea of international cooperation, for it is perceived as ceding space in terms of national sovereignty. Now, the present world, let me turn to possible scenarios for 2050. The present world order is confronted with the fundamental problem that the balance of power is now very different from what it was in 1945. The rise of developing Asia, concentrated in China, which gathered momentum after 1990, has slowly chipped away at the economic dominance and political hegemony of the United States and Western Europe. The story, may I stress, is about more than China. In 2022, the share of China in world GDP was 18%, while that of the rest of developing Asia was 14%. Now, the geopolitics of the world has also changed profoundly because of unexpected developments. The United States, in a withdrawal syndrome, appears to be relinquishing its leadership role in the world. Be that as it may, the decline of Western Europe, in a relative rather than absolute sense, is discernible. The globalization of Islam also seeks to challenge Western hegemony. Of course, by far the most significant change is the rise of China, with its aspiration for a superpower status at par with the United States. At this juncture, it may be plausible to suggest, but impossible to establish, that the 21st century in its third decade could be a turning point for the world order, similar to those in the late 18th and early 20th centuries, which could be the beginning of the end of the dominance of the United States in the world. But this, I believe, is mere speculation, for there is an important lesson that emerges from history. Dominant powers are always reluctant to cede economic or political space to newcomers that are rising powers. History reveals that the emergence of new centers of production in economics and new centers of power in politics does erode the hegemonic dominance, but such changing realities remain unrecognized for long, often ignored. Thus, processes of change in the world order are always slow. What is more, this is a complex phenomenon which unravels and unfolds over a long period of time. Both the duration and the outcome of this process are unpredictable. Now, in my view, the present conjuncture is an interregnum because the resurgence of Asia, except for China, is not large enough to shift the hegemonic balance. The United States remains the dominant economic and political and military power in the world, and even if it no longer seeks a proactive role in the world, possibly because its domestic political constituencies are not supportive of the idea, there is no other country yet that could replace the United States in this hegemonic role, which has multiple dimensions. Most importantly, perhaps, the United States is the only country that has a national currency which is the equivalent of international money. So, an overwhelming proportion of trade, investment, and finance between countries is denominated in US dollars, just as both public and private debt is denominated in US dollars. It's the institutional dimension of its dominance is diminishing because the world has changed profoundly since then, and the political framework for international cooperation and peace is there, part of the old US world order, but no longer credible or effective. Given this fluid and uncertain situation, I believe that we are at the early stages of a world order in transition. We can only speculate about alternative future scenarios of a world order that might emerge by 2050, a quarter century from now, or even later. Now, I pose these alternatives in the form of 4 questions. First, are we witnessing the beginnings of a transformative change in the world economy, or world order, over the next 25 years? Second, are we at the cusp of an emerging bipolar world yet again, as it was in the Cold War era, with the United States and China as the 2 superpowers? Third, are we moving towards a multipolar world in which the United States and China may be the key players, but there will be another 8-10 countries that are also key players? Fourth, are we going to live with a fluid situation where the world order remains in transition, even for the next 25 years. Now, I will endeavor to provide my answers to each of these questions in turn. This is bound to be speculative. Yet, thinking ahead, I believe, is part of the way forward. Now, there are observers who believe that we are witnessing the beginnings of a transformative change in the world over the next 25 years. The recent rise of Asia and the emerging powerhouse economies in Asia, among which China is the most visible, has led to an idea or hope voiced by some that the 21st century could turn out to be the Asian century. The parallels drawn sometimes are with Great Britain in the 19th century and the United States in the 20th century, when the dominance of these countries was reflected in politics, economics, and even culture. There can be little doubt that circa 2050, a century after the end of colonial rule, Asia will account for at least 2/5, if not one half, of world income and will be home to about 3/5 of the people on Earth. It will have not only an economic significance, which was the reality in 1820, but also a political significance in the world that would have been difficult to imagine in 1970. In terms of income per capita, however, it will be nowhere near as rich as the United States or Western Europe. Thus, Asian countries such as China, India, and Indonesia will emerge as world powers, but without the income levels of the rich countries. Asia will not have the dominance that Great Britain did in the past, or the United States has even now in withdrawal syndrome, straddling the economic sphere and the political realm, which, while stretching beyond those to culture. Moreover, there is a fundamental flaw in this comparison. Great Britain and the United States were states that were hegemons. Asia is a continent in geographical space, comprising 48 countries, with a total population of 4.8 billion that stretches across a vast geographical space from East Asia through Southeast Asia, South Asia, Central Asia, and on to West Asia. Given this heterogeneity, juxtaposed with these contradictions and conflicts, it is difficult even to imagine a Pax Asiana. For different reasons, and I'll come to that in a moment, a Pax Sinica, China-led, is just as difficult to imagine. In my view, therefore, the idea of an Asian century is hyperbole rather than a plausible prospect. The idea that we are at the cusp of an emerging bipolar system world yet again, as it was in the Cold War era, with the United States and China as the two superpower rivals this time around, competing for their respective spheres in the world, is more plausible, but does require systematic analysis. Now, given the time constraint, I'm only going to provide a brief intuitive assessment of this hypothesis using plausible reasoning. At the outset, it must be recognized that for the USSR, superpower rivalry with the United States was political. It was driven by ideology and reinforced by military power with no parity in income levels. In that sense, China is similar. However, there is a fundamental difference in the economic dimensions of the relationship. There was almost no economic engagement between the United States and the erstwhile USSR. In sharp contrast, the Chinese economy is interlocked with the American economy through international trade, international investment, international finance. Indeed, more than 50%, close to 60% of China's massive foreign exchange reserves are held in US dollar bonds or US Treasury bills. Now, in the early 1930s, Keynes wrote that if you owe someone £100, go back, index it to 1930, it's your problem. If you owe someone £1 million, it's their problem. So China does have a problem in this respect vis-a-vis the United States. Now, the notion of a bipolar world is often based on projections of GDP. For example, those by Goldman Sachs or by OECD, which are simply linear extrapolations based on assumptions. But the real world is not about the arithmetic of compound growth rates. Sure, if national income grows at 10% per annum, you will double it in 7 years. If per capita income grows at 7% per annum, you will double per capita income in 10 years. The critical determinants of growth underlying such projections are three: population, productivity, and the exchange rate, because you're making international comparisons. Now, for China, its surplus of labor is exhausted and its workforce has peaked. So that economic growth in China will now depend entirely on productivity increase, which most analysts believe will be at most 3% per annum. If that is lower, growth will slow further. Similarly, any fall in fertility rates, and fertility rates have begun to decline in China, will have the same effect and dampen growth. Just as important, such projections of catch-up in GDP are very sensitive to assumptions about prices, particularly the exchange rate. Therefore, if the appreciation of the Chinese yuan is less than expected, the date for catching up with the United States GDP will be deferred further in time. Now, you might recall when Jim O'Neill did the first BRICS projections, that China was going to overtake the United States in GDP in 2025. Slowly, that shifted to 2035, 2045. It's now 2055. I'm not going to be around in 2055, but I am convinced that the US will still have the much larger GDP. It will be the largest economy in the world. But most importantly, my belief that China has peaked comes from a world beyond economics. The most important underlying assumption is that the political system in China will be a continuation of the past 50 years. Okay? Now, it's not as if President Xi Jinping is very powerful, but there are discontents that are rising. In sum, I'm skeptical about the notion of a bipolar world in 2050. The most likely scenario, and I must say it's my preferred scenario, in 2050 is a multipolar world in which dominance might not be so striking. The United States and China will most probably be the leading countries with an economic and political significance in the world. But I think this group will be much larger. Among the industrialized high-income countries, it will include Germany and France for sure. Britain, it seems to me, is now in absolute decline. I would have put it there 2 years ago. I'm not sure I would put it there now. As well as Japan from Asia. Taken together, these countries account for a little more than 1/6 of world GDP at present. It will almost certainly include India and Indonesia from developing Asia, and Brazil and Mexico from Latin America. Beyond these 10 countries, there may be other countries in the group, including Russia, but that is very difficult to predict. Russia's share of world GDP is only 1.7% at this moment. In such a multipolar world, the distribution of economic and political power will be less unequal than at present, but large asymmetries will remain. Of course, much as I like the idea, the mere existence of such a multipolar world cannot create a new world order. This would require cohesion and cooperation amongst the two biggest players, the US and China, with a smaller subset, say, of 10 countries. But it would also have to be based on consultations with a much larger number of countries to evolve a framework for a world order that is mutually acceptable. This might be feasible if there is a shift in the balance of economic power in the world such that 10 countries, the other 10, taken together are larger than one of the two big countries and closer to the other in economic size. If this does happen, it would conform to the idea of a multipolar world, genuinely multipolar world. It would also reduce, even though it cannot eliminate, the present democratic deficit in the world order. Okay, now, so what does this lead to? The most probable outcome, in my view, is that we are going to live with a fluid situation where the world order remains in transition over the next 25 years, so that there is a de facto continuation of Pax Americana. This is essentially what we might call in today's parlance the default option. The construction of a new world order is now far more difficult now than it was 75 years ago. The reason is obvious. There has been a profound change in the global distribution of economic power over the past 75 years. In 1950, the United States was the dominant economic and political power. The past 2 decades since the early 2000s have witnessed an erosion in its economic dominance and political hegemony, even though its share of world GDP has remained roughly the same. Hence, at this juncture, no single country has the dominance to create a new world order as the United States could and did in 1950. Building a consensus to address cross-national and cross-domain challenges is increasingly more difficult, so apparent from this very painfully slow progress in climate change negotiations. Bill, let alone efforts at preserving peace in the world. Aging populations, food shortages, water scarcities, recurring pandemics are the new challenges confronting the world. Their economic consequences might reinforce nationalisms, xenophobic attitudes, and even militarisms. The possible impact of profound technological changes on the horizon, which you read about every day, only adds to the complexity and the uncertainty. Of course, the United States retains some essential attributes of a hegemon in its economic size, in its technological cutting edge, in its military strength, in its political influence, in its soft power, and above all, in a national currency that's the equivalent of international money. However, its engagement with and commitment to the world order it created in the late 1940s has been significantly diminished by its withdrawal syndrome. This is manifest in the reluctance of domestic political constituencies to let their government perform such a role. Now, a political polarization, which we now see in the US, is associated often with a legislative gridlock that makes the task even more difficult. But that is not all. The soft power and the moral credibility of the United States has also been eroded by the divergence between proclaimed principle and actual practice. Legal exceptionalism, unilateral sanctions, which depart from a rules-based world order that it created. Now, in this context, a commitment to and participation in forging sustainable policies to combat climate change will do more to restore its moral credibility than any other single step. Yet, the emergence of another hegemon in the world could replace the United States does not seem to me a plausible idea at this juncture. A quarter century from now, a multipolar world is possible, even probable outcome. However, the ability of a dozen countries in this multipolar world to cooperate with each other, as well as consult a wider range of smaller countries to construct a new world order, is a more distant prospect. Thus, the default option of a prolonged interregnum in which the world order remains in crisis and transition is where we are most likely to be in 2050. Historical experience suggests that crises or wars that lead to decisive shifts are the catalysts of change. This was so in 1945. Economic and political realities have changed profoundly since then. I think the world should not have to wait another crisis of such proportions to act. The existing world order is clearly under stress, the symptoms are worrisome, and there are alarm bells. We can only hope that enlightened self-interest and wise political leadership of major countries, which is clearly not on the horizon, will provide the impetus for international cooperation and collective action. Now, if I was doing this talk 3 months ago, I could happily have concluded here. However, Donald Trump was elected president of the United States in early November and assumed office as president of the United States in late January, barely 6 weeks ago. So, the unexpected can and does happen. What are the implications and consequences of Donald Trump, you might ask, for the world order and the crisis in crisis and transition that I have focused on over the last 40 minutes? Um, John Maynard Keynes made a distinction between risk and uncertainty. Risk is something you can model. Risk is something you can assign probabilities to. Risk is something you can insure against. But uncertainty is pure uncertainty. Now, Donald Trump is about uncertainty. He epitomizes uncertainty. You all read the newspapers. He says one day that I shall withdraw from the WHO. He says 2 days later that I will stay in the WHO if a United States citizen is appointed Director General. He says that he will turn the Gaza Strip into the equivalent of a French Riviera and resettle 2 million Palestinians somewhere else in the world whom no one is willing to accept. And he changes his mind. Now, I am engaging in loud thinking. I have no means of knowing. I have no crystal ball. And to understand what Donald Trump may or may not do requires someone with superhuman knowledge. I don't have that. But what can we observe? And what is it that is between the lines? The said and the unsaid, simply put. On what is said, Donald Trump has made it clear that he will bring the wars between Russia and Ukraine and Israel and Hamas to an end. Okay? He will end both wars, but he will end both wars in a partisan manner because he's clearly aligned himself with Vladimir Putin, just as he aligned himself with Prime Minister Netanyahu. So it's a kind of pro-Russian, pro-Israel stance to end the war. The question is, how will it sustain? Hamas and the Palestinians won't disappear from the face of the earth. Ukraine will not disappear. It may be overrun. Donald Trump is also very clear about reciprocal tariffs, a return to what I call mercantilism. Exports are good, imports are bad. So if you run a trade surplus, you're a bad guy. And if you run a trade deficit, you're a good guy. Now, he actually, in doing so, the WTO has been almost dead for 10 years because the United States has not allowed its dispute settlement mechanism to function. It doesn't have judges to perform that function. And now he seeks to bury what is almost dead. But there were two important underlying principles in the erstwhile GATT and the present WTO. One was the principle of non-discrimination, and the other was the most favored nation clause. In other words, if I offer access to my market on a set of terms to country A that is a member of the WTO, then I must offer exactly the same terms, the most favored nation clause. And that there's a principle of non-discrimination. The only exception was, say, the European Union or common markets or customs unions, which were written into the WTO agreements. Three, Trump is making noises much like President McKinley in the early 20th century, President of the United States, who actually was probably imperialist. Now, the US has never been explicitly imperialist because it was a colony itself, colonized by the British. The only colony it had was the Philippines. Yeah? But in effect, during the between 1900 and 1914, the US almost acquired hegemony over most Latin American countries. Now, the US did not do that. It fought its own wars and lost many of them in Afghanistan, in Vietnam, for ideological purposes. But he now seeks to acquire Greenland, to think of Canada as a 51st state, to rename the Panama Canal, to rename the Gulf of Mexico. Grandiose ideas, but a lot of it is bluster. I don't know Certainly he will end the Russia-Ukraine war. He will end the Israel-Hamas conflict, but with what consequences is not clear. There is a lot that is unsaid also. You know, Donald Trump, before he was elected, engaged the Heritage Foundation in the United States to do a study on what he should do should he be elected president of the United States to the world order the United States created. Now, I understand it's not in the public domain, but a withdrawal from the United Nations is on the cards. And if not that, a sharp cutback in US support for the United Nations. China's contribution to the United Nations has increased in recent years, but is no substitute for the kind of support the UN provided to the UN system. But what is more, the Bretton Woods twins, the World Bank and the IMF, the Heritage Foundation is suggesting that the United States should withdraw from it. Now, the United States has a 17.5% share in the World Bank and the IMF, enough to veto any change in its Articles of Association. But 83% is owned by other countries. They could conceivably keep the World Bank and the IMF going. The relationship with Western Europe is half said and half unsaid. NATO countries, other than the United States, have to pay for themselves for their defense. But whether Trump will keep the NATO going is less than clear. He has said nothing yet about Latin America, Africa, and Asia, except China and India, where he has specific concerns about high tariffs, except on immigration and on tariffs. Thus far, everything that has been said, although much less has been done, suggests that Donald Trump has no desire or intention of preserving the world order that was established by the United States in the late 1940s. The statements are negative or disruptive, and there is not even a hint of creative destruction. Joseph Schumpeter used the phrase creative destruction, which was a natural part of capitalism, that you have to be creative if you dismantle something. But at this moment, the only evidence I see is of dismantling and withdrawing, but not what would be put in place. All I can see, before and after the election of Trump is a withdrawal syndrome. Now, the question, I don't know the answer, I can only speculate, is this feasible? For one, at home in the United States, for another, in the outside world. Now, if you think of Trump's campaign agenda and what he has explicitly issued so many executive orders on, he wishes to introduce reciprocal tariffs. And there is despite the Indian media going soft that we have a special relationship, it will be China and India for sure, and a lot of other countries, with no concessions. Actually, he announced that yesterday. On April 1st, these will come into effect. And he is bringing an end to he says, to immigration. But it seems to me at this moment it is bluster, because all that he is doing is deporting people who were detained crossing the border from Mexico into the United States or Canada into the United States. The US is impossible to go into the US, bound by the Atlantic and the Pacific. The only way in is through Mexico. And so there was a symbolic, you send them sort of handcuffed, feet in chains and so on. But the Pew Research Center in the US estimates that there are 750,000 undocumented migrants, which is the American terminology for illegal immigrants, in the United States. And there are 5 million undocumented immigrants in the United States altogether, of whom a little less than 1/5 are from India, more than 1/6. Now, there is no way that he is going to be able to easily find them and deport them. The question is, what are I don't know what will happen on that, but the consequences are clear. The moment Trump introduces high reciprocal tariffs, the prices of imported consumer goods will rise. The United States at this moment has no capacity to produce labor-intensive manufactured consumer goods. At the same time, if it does come down on immigration, illegal immigrants, there will be no, there is dirty, demanding, and dangerous work in the US, which no US resident or citizen is willing to do. So, whether it is plucking fruit in farms, whether it's working as shop assistants, whether it's working on construction, cleaning windows, repairing roads, all you see is illegal immigrants, mostly from Central America. So, two things will happen. A, prices of goods will rise. B, wages will rise. Because to get people to replace them to do this work will mean a pressure, upward pressure on wages. Now, whether he can sustain its politics, I am not sure. Now, it is, in a sense, a naked power politics reminiscent of imperialism when the British Empire was at its zenith in the late 19th century. But the world is very different now. It is not what it was 1870 to 1914 that Hobsbawm called the age of empire. And it's also very different from what it was in the late 1940s when the US political power and economic dominance was at its peak. Okay? Now, let me conclude. It's been 40 minutes since I started, just 2 minutes more. In conclusion, and there can be no definite conclusion, you can see we are in a world of uncertainty, it would seem that Donald Trump has a disdain for multilateralism, which provided the essential foundations for the world order that was created by the United States in the late 1940s. The pronouncements of President Trump so far and actions suggest that he has a clear revealed preference for bilateralism and at best plurilateralism, which is consistent with his transactional approach to international relations in the sphere of the economic and in the realm of the political. This bluster is easier said than done. For one, he does not have the imperial power that Great Britain had during the Age of Empire, nor does he have the economic and political dominance bordering on hegemony that the United States had in 1945. For another, the geopolitics of the contemporary world is diverse and complex. Western Europe and Japan are in relative decline. China is on the rise. Russia aspires for a seat at the high table, but we also have the rest of Asia rising. A Latin America of middle-income countries in churn, and an underdeveloped Africa with an enormous potential implicit, embedded in the reality that it is the only continent where population growth will continue during the second half of the 21st century. Any settlement with one will have spillovers elsewhere. The global south is a phrase I dislike, but much as I don't like the phrase, we need to recognize that Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean together in 2023 accounted for 80% of world population and 40% of world GDP. So that they are not inconsequential in the process. Now, I'm sorry to conclude on this uncertain note, but as I said, I don't have a crystal ball. We need to recognize that Trump may be introducing a new world disorder. It's also possible. Yeah? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Nair. May I please request Nitin Pai, co-founder and director of the Takshila Institution, to facilitate the Q&A with Professor Nair and perhaps ask him the first question.
Good evening, everyone. Professor Nair, thank you very much for giving us 45 minutes of an ability to sit back and reflect on this question taken out from the here and the now. Because for the last 2 months or so, 3 months or so, or maybe 2 years or so, the news breaks are happening at the, almost on an hourly basis. So you sleep at night and wake up in the morning and it's a very new world, right? So it's good that we got a chance to reflect on this. Uh, as Sandhya said, I'll take the first question and then I'll open it up to the others. So you all can think of your questions. The mic will come to you. My question to you is, okay, first of all, it's nice that you said Pax Mysteriana, which means that we're going to have peace, but it's going to come from some mysterious source. So that's good news there. But the more serious question is, if the United States was underwriting the United Nations, European security, NATO, Japan, Korea for so long, was it their fault that they took this for granted? 70, 80 years? You expect to get a free ride for 70, 80 years? I mean, as economists, we know there's no such thing as a free lunch. And now that the bill is presented to you, everybody's in shock. Don't you think it's sort of, I don't know, taking it for granted? Can we be, should we have sympathy for places like Europe because they just took it for granted?
That's an important question and a good question. Can you hear me? Yeah. You see, the United States in the early post-war era was magnanimous beyond belief. They helped the reconstruction of Germany and of Japan. The Marshall aid that was provided to Europe, including Britain, helped Europe reconstruct after the war. It helped not only Japan rise from that nuclear holocaust, but it also helped South Korea and Taiwan to become the East Asian success stories they did. Because please remember that the land reform in South Korea and in Taiwan was carried out by General MacArthur, by the United States. And that land reform was a very important part of the success that followed. Of course, these countries also had US aid. Remember, this was the Cold War era. These countries had preferential access to markets. Now, it is true that everybody had begun to assume that this would be there. But we need to remember that neither Germany nor Japan were allowed to rearm. They did not have armies of their own. That was the condition imposed by the United States and by the Allies. But certainly, Europe became complicit. It was a free ride. They contributed nothing to the resources of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, of NATO. And in a sense, for Europe, this is a reality check. At one point, I think Angela Merkel said that we account for 4% or 6%. The US is 4% of world population, 7% of world population, 25% of world GDP, and 50% of social expenditure. So Europe built on its ideology of a social democracy that continued with Angela Merkel, a kind of a welfare state. Although movement to the right and the retreat from the state, the move to markets happened everywhere in Europe. But there was a complacence that came, thank you, Sandhya, there was a complacence that came from assuming that the US will continue to provide resources. But we must recognize that Germany and Japan, Prime Minister Abe made an effort to try and get Japan to build an army. Didn't succeed. So the question is, if we leave out Germany and Japan, which were not allowed any expenditure on an army, they could have provided resources to NATO. They never did. But others, such as Britain, France, just abandoned the project. So Trump, in that sense, is, what is right or wrong, I don't know, but it's warranted. He says, you guys have free ride for a long time, contribute. So I think Europe will have to reinvent itself. Europe, in my view, in other work I have done, Western Europe is a continent in significant relative decline that could border on an absolute decline. I think the United Kingdom is in absolute decline. It's the only country in the world where per capita income has not returned to pre-pandemic levels. Its per capita income today is what it was in 2013, and is expected to get back to that level in 2027, the pre-pandemic level. So clearly, Europe has to either reinvent itself, it's a wake-up call, or they will slowly vanish. There will be and the rise and fall of nations in history. There was once a Pax Mongolica. They ruled much of the world from 1200 to the mid 13th century, mid 14th century. Um, so the world has changed. Everybody did take this for granted, and in a sense, Trump's political constituency at home is about that. He said three things: that A, we don't want illegal immigrants. B, we don't want prices of goods that families consume at home to rise, and we don't want Americans to die in wars outside the US. It had an appeal. Now the question is that this is a wake-up call for Western Europe. So what they do, say, in the discussions on Ukraine, although both Mr. Starmer and Mr. Macron were on a very timid role in their visit to the White House. So, one, I agree that Europe will have to contribute to its own defenses. And certainly they're paranoid about Vladimir Putin and Russia. Although the capacity of Putin to sustain this war and conflict is very limited. Hundreds and thousands of people from Russia have died. It's not a very popular thing. It's a kind of resurgent nationalism. So Europe will have to reinvent itself. I think China will have to begin to look at the comfort of a market for consumer goods that was easily accessible in the US. But at the same time, the US will also have to consider the consequences of this domestic at home, so that if wages rise and prices rise, Trump's two commitments will be diluted. So it's a fair question to ask. My answer is A, Europe will have to rethink, and if they want to be the Europe they were, then they will have to move into the world of hard power. At the moment, outside the United States, hard power exists in China and to some extent in India. In terms of, if you look at the size of the military, it's large. So that will have to happen. I think there will have to be a rethink in China, because their problem is that they relied on exports to drive their growth, but domestic consumption is repressed. Our consumption is also declining, but as a proportion of GDP, private final consumer expenditure in India is close to 60%. In China, it's 35%. So everybody is going to have to rethink. And the media in India seems to have made a very optimistic interpretation of the Modi visit. There are no exceptions for Mr. Modi in Mr. Trump's world, and he's announced it. So I think it's not just the United States that has to rethink what it is doing, but at the moment it is seeking to focus on the short term and is seeking to focus on its own national interests. However, we live in an interdependent world. The United States is also very dependent on the outside world, as is its prosperity. So everybody is going to need a rethink on this blunderbuss strategy of Trump, including Mr. Trump himself.
I'll sort of scan this way, right? So the lady at the back.
Thank you. My name is Devaki. Thank you for the very eloquent articulation of our global past, present, and future.
You need to use your mic closer to yourself.
Sorry, is this
I was
audible?
making the same mistake.
Yeah. My question is, what role do you see of multi-billionaires and giants like the Bezos, Musk, Altman, Zuckerbergs of the world, whose power and influence go beyond business interests and have ability to influence culture, manufacture opinions, dissent, information flow, influence finance, technology, even national elections, even beyond their sovereign borders? And how significant would their role be in the new world order? That's one question. The second question is
Let's keep it at one, because we've got a few more.
Thank you.
You want to answer this?
Yeah, I can answer it. We can take 3 questions, or we'll let me answer this very quickly, and then we'll take 3, and I will answer them in turn. Uh, I assume that you are referring primarily to Elon Musk,
And people like
but at Trump's inaugural, the head of Meta, Zuckerberg, the head of Google, the head of Microsoft, the head of Amazon were all there. And in many ways, these people are almost as powerful as the president of the United States. So if Elon Musk were to shut down Starlink, the Ukraine war will end, because they have no means of communication other than that. Clearly, this group of people have lined up with great clarity behind Donald Trump. So I don't think they're going to be working at cross purposes with him. There will be some conflicts of interest, surely. But on the whole, they will stay with him. My own hypothesis, I have no scientific basis for saying that, is given that I'm not Sigmund Freud, given the personalities of Donald Trump and Elon Musk, it's not a matter of if, but when they will fall apart, because they're both very strong, dominant personalities. But the others will almost certainly play along with Trump. That's quite clear. In terms, say, Jeff Bezos actually has, the Washington Post lost 250,000 subscribers. And yet he stopped any writing of editorials on that. New York Times has stopped Paul Krugman's column. The world is changing. These people are important, but they are in business. You're right, they have a worldwide influence. I am not on social media, but I know so many of my former students, so many young people are. So they have enormous influence they can exercise. But at the moment, I think they are in tandem with Donald Trump. He and Musk may have a fallout for other reasons, personality reasons. And Trump is going to do what he has said he's going to do. That's quite clear. I mean, all this business of e-cars in the US, he's going to stifle. But he will want Elon Musk to get access to the Indian market to sell his Tesla from China.
I'll go, there was this lady here. So I'm just going this way and then I'll come past. We'll do 3 questions and
3
then.
questions at a time, yeah. That's more equitable, yeah.
Sir, according to you, in the Asia-centric world that you envisioned, how do you think the hegemonic system will evolve in Asia, within the Asian countries, and what is the role of regional groupings in this transformation that's happening?
So there was, wait, oh here, the person in the black shirt right here.
So my question, just let me bring that up. Yes. So will this recent round of tariffs and reverse tariffs, like a multi-front trade war at the US coming at it, will it be seen, let's say in 2050, as the US shooting itself in the foot? Because of course, the yuan has to strengthen a lot to really be a challenge to the dollar, right? Where United States, through agreements, a lot of world trade still goes on in the dollar. But then BRICS and more countries are joining BRICS as well, leading to somewhat of a challenge to the US dollar, right? And along with that, this tariff war that is coming, where United States is not prepared to be able to have so many jobs, and because of the strengthening dollar, domestically it's going to be really expensive for them to produce and pay the workers their wages, right? So the middle class and the poorer class in the US suffers. There definitely a lot of ripple effects on the dollar, right?
Yeah.
Okay,
and
3 questions.
yeah,
Okay.
that's right. And the gentleman on the gray shirt,
After this, I'll go back. Otherwise,
sure.
I haven't scribbled what people said. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, everybody is worried about the tariff and everything. What immediate reaction it will happen on Indian industry and Indian economy?
Yeah, that's a precise question. Yeah,
I
I start
think
with.
we'll stop here.
I'll start with.
So Asian, she talked about Asian alignments. His was about currency and tariffs, and the third one was about impact on India.
Yeah. Okay, got it. Now, please recognize that once upon a time, Japan was the hub of the Asian economy until about 1990. In the past 25 years, that has been transformed altogether. And China is the hub for the Asian economy. In a sense, India is marginal. Its trade with Asia is not that much. It's much more with Western Europe, Africa, North America. Now, I think in a sense, the Asian regional grouping is going to make little or no difference. There's only one grouping left. SARC was dead even before it was born in South Asia. But ASEAN also is now so completely dependent on China and interlocked with the Chinese economy. And you have a situation where they are, the Chinese are using Vietnam, Philippines, Thailand, Indonesia, to move their production so that it can enter the United States at normal tariffs. But these countries are deeply resentful of what China is doing. They are bringing even their workers. So let alone technology transfer, they're not even creating employment for local people. So I don't think Asian regional groupings are going to have much impact or influence. Japan, 25 years ago, would have had a very significant impact. But with this decline, Japan, the Republic of Korea are not going to be, so in a sense, is the Asian giants. China much more than India, but I think they are going to be relevant in Trump's calculus, more so. But I don't know what Trump's understanding is. You have Marco Rubio saying that, a kind of entente or détente with Russia is the Nixon and Kissinger moment. I'm not sure. It's not clear to me. My answer to your question is Asia and its regional groupings in Asia are irrelevant. It'll be essentially China in large part, India in much smaller part, and to some extent Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. Now, I have no idea what Trump will do on Taiwan, and we wait with bated breath. Sorry, your question was
Tariffs and currency, US currency.
Yeah. Look, we've been through this once before, exactly 100 years ago. As countries to cope with the slump in the late 20s, only the US prospered at that time. Europe went through a very bad phase, hyperinflation, rise of fascism, and so on. But the response of everyone, including the United States, to the Great Depression, that was Roosevelt's executive orders, was bigger than ever policies, high tariffs. Now, everybody was worse off as a result. And if you get retaliation, then what happens is, trade theory will tell you, after a point, trade will come to zero. It's the logical continuum. So there can be no doubt in my mind that anything which engages in reciprocal tariffs or a trade war will leave everybody worse off, including the United States compared with earlier. All right? The United States, please remember, with a strong dollar and a big market, had the access to consumer goods for their citizens. They were cheap. They were significantly cheaper. I don't think even for a moment that the yuan will ever become an international currency. You need to recognize, the United States is the United States. When the euro came to life or began life, the EU believed that they will make euro a currency that matches the US dollar as international money. It didn't happen. Why not? The reason was that the Europeans did not want to run current account deficits. How on earth can you become an international currency if you don't run current account deficits, all right? China is even more mercantilist than Trump. They have accumulated huge trade surpluses for the past 30 years. So much so that almost everyone in the world is beginning to resent it. You look at even their trade pattern with India. Look at the huge deficit we have with them. And we export only primary commodities and import only manufactured goods. So I don't think that there is an alternative currency. Yeah? The United States is the only country that has been willing to run a current account deficit forever, yeah? But they haven't minded because they have what we call the benefits of seigniorage. The United States is the only country in the world that does not have to borrow abroad. Yeah? It borrows through intermediation in domestic capital markets. It can borrow from India, from Japan, from France, from Germany, because all the money is in US capital markets. So that, I think the answer to your question, two questions, there is no international currency that is the equivalent of international money, even on the distant horizon. It is and will remain for some time the US dollar. All right? And reciprocal tariffs, trade wars will leave everyone worse off. That's an important question. I'm not sure I have an answer. I think that, I am an academic, I'm a scholar, I don't know the real politic of India, but if I read the newspapers, the media seems to give to me the impression that somehow Mr. Modi has a special relationship with Trump. Now, that's myth. Trump is clearly hard-headed. I mean, when Modi went to see him, he said, our media portrayed it as if it was a great success. Yeah? But the fact is that Trump said that I am going to impose reciprocal tariffs. And Trump said this himself at the press conference later. And Modi said, I don't like that. And Trump said, I don't care whether you like it or not. I'm going to do it. So for India, I think there will be a problem, because our tariffs are high. And given that we have a problem of competing in world markets, costs of logistics are high, the rupee is too overvalued. I mean, it's crazy. It's the only currency we say we have depreciated vis-a-vis the US dollar. But every other currency has depreciated far more vis-a-vis the euro dollar. So our real effective exchange rate is going up. So I think India will have to be proactive in terms of policy. Now, it is only partly what industry can do, but I think the exchange rate is a price and it needs a downward adjustment for sure. Tariffs, there will be tariffs. Trump has announced that there will be reciprocal tariffs. And I think, Modi's concession on reducing duties on bourbon and on Harley Davidsons is not going to make an iota of a difference, because these are not even a drop of water in an ocean. The real problems are elsewhere. It will almost, the US is our largest market for exports. It's a very important source of strategic imports for us, particularly of technology. Although a lot of it is being developed by people who were born and brought up in India, but are now the soft power of the United States. So there can be no doubt that the Indian economy and industry will be adversely affected in the short run. But how long Trump continues this and how quickly India adjusts. And we don't have that structural flexibility in India. We won't adjust as rapidly as China will to the change in the US stance. So my answer to your question is, yes, it will adversely affect. We need a nimble government with diplomatic skills. I worry, the 6 countries in Europe signed the Treaty of Rome to form the common market in 1956. 11 years after World War II came to an end. The partition of British India happened in 1947. The trade between South Asian countries, intra-South Asian trade, is not even 2% of our total trade. Our relationship, and it's a huge market for India. If there were a South Asian free trade area, the real beneficiary in the long run would be India. The real beneficiary in the long run would be India. But we seem to have lost the trust of our neighbors, almost every country. And China is the elephant in the room. They have succeeded in wooing all our neighbors, Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Pakistan. So there's going to be, Sri Lanka may be a balance because Dissanayake seems smart enough because he recognizes that India and Modi helped him out when China vetoed the IMF loan in the board. So India did accept a lot of externals. Sorry, let me stop there.
So I'll go again, the lady at the back. Again, I'll go left to right, my left to right. So everybody gets an even chance and Sandhya gets to move around with the mic.
So my question is regarding the statement we keep hearing European leaders make. Even Meloni, for that matter, though she aligns with Trump, she keeps saying that to align with Russia would be the decline of Western ideals of democracy, of free speech, of protection of diversity and inclusion. And given that India and our government post-freedom is modeled on, a Western-style democracy, but having said that, we look at China and Russia, they do posture as more imperialist authoritarian regimes. And now Trump and US is doing that too. So what is your take on the future of democracy, both for India and the world? Will we see a form of democracy that's more imperialist, more quasi-monarchical in some way, more protectionist, or will the current form of democracy somehow turn around and thrive?
Yeah, oh, sorry, I should wait.
Let's do the
Democracy.
anybody, sir, in the middle.
Thank you, Dr. Lal, for a very, thank you, Dr. Nair, for a very interesting talk. But I thought that you could probably add something in terms of the use of nuclear weapons. The clear message that I take away is that if Ukraine had not denuclearized, Putin would not have moved that aggressively in 2010. Also, if Iran had nuclear weapons, the entire Middle East picture would have changed somewhat. And the reason I say that is that because of nuclear weapons, the whole world gives Russia a lot of importance, because at 1.7% of the world GDP, it's basically an oil and gas station in the middle of Europe. It doesn't have any other product that is of international significance. So I think that when we look at this, we do need to factor in the fact that we are probably giving too much importance to Russia in the new world order and probably not enough to China.
Okay. One question from this side, that's the last one. Yeah, the gentleman in the black shirt, yeah.
Democracy, nuclear weapons.
Is there a chance that America might devalue the dollar? Any sense for them to do that?
Okay, devaluation. Okay.
Let's take these.
Okay, let me just address this. It's now, time and patience are both exhaustible resources. So in Delhi, my experience is that by 8 beginning of people are.
And BIC has a tradition of punctuality. So start on time and we end on time.
So we'll finish on time. I'll give you brief answers. For me, democracy is a prior. And I think democracy is the only way forward. It's not as if democracy does not have flaws or warts. Democracies take a long time to evolve. We've been around for 75 years, but that's a short time in the life of a democracy. At the same time, democracies are at risk in the world, everywhere. The rise of populist, nationalist political leaders really represent an exploitation of the social and political discontents and economic discontents among people with markets and globalization. It brought prosperity to a few, but exclusion for the many. And that's why, and there was no distinction between the left and the right parties anymore. There was no ideological distinction. They were the same. So in a choiceless democracy, people opted for these populist leaders. And there are so many of them. All of them have been elected through the democratic process, but they undermine the very democratic process that elected them. You can take the example of Mr. Trump, Mr. Johnson, Orban, Erdogan, Modi, everywhere. Xi Jinping is not elected, but he's exactly the same. And I think ultimately democracy is superior because it is the only political system that has some self-correcting mechanisms, however slow, and it's only political system that does something to protect the rights and freedoms of citizens. To me, that matters. You are right. I think that Trump overestimates the significance of Vladimir Putin But please remember that there's a history. You know, the spat in the Oval Office with Zelensky was when Trump in his first term wanted evidence on Biden's son, he refused to cooperate. All right. When there was the battle with Hillary Clinton, that electoral battle that Trump won, Putin was his allies. He leaked the tapes. So I'm not sure it's about realpolitik. I think it's also a little bit about personal connections. I think he overestimates the significance of Russia. Clearly, he does not recognize that Russia now is not, it's at the bottom of the high-income countries, $14,000 per capita barely. But, significant parts of Russia are now colonized by China. Siberia and the other less accessible areas, Chinese have moved in there with their workers. Forests are being felled, wood is being transported to China, furniture made and sold. So Mr. Putin is not an independent, a free agent. So I think that Nixonian movement is not true. And yeah, the answer is no. The US cannot decide what its exchange rate will be. Please remember, it's financial markets that decide what the exchange rate will be. And if Trump is going to, if he raises interest rates, you've seen the portfolio investment fly out of India. Stock markets have plummeted. The capital is going back to the US from everywhere, from Europe, from East Asia, from India, from Latin America, from more prosperous countries in the Middle East. So that is actually going to lead to an appreciation of the US dollar. I don't think the US government has no power. They can change interest rates, the Federal Reserve, but they have no power because markets determine the US dollar exchange rate.
So thank you very much for listening. I think we had a great conversation, and thank you for enlightening us.